All right, let's move on a bit to a bit of a more broader discussion. So let's talk a bit about teams and how the team itself could impact how their individual fantasy players do. So we're going to talk about how the players and how winning is related to these fantasy points that we talk about all the time. So I'll kick it off first. So one of the teams that I think are very risky to pick players from is the Memphis Grizzlies. So right now, if you look at their guard rotations, they have around 6 guards that share a lot of the minutes together. And outside of John Morant, who's playing around 31 minutes, and Dylan Brooks, who's playing at around 30 minutes as well, pretty consistent. You also have other guards such as DeAnthony Melton, Grayson Allen, Tyus Jones, and Desmond Bain. So that's 6 guards all sharing that backcourt rotation, and that's really hard to sometimes predict which guards to stream, especially when they're all healthy. Sometimes the coach changes up the backcourt lineup. I know some of the guards, such as Dylan Brooks, can play like a small forward position, but they all kind of share like the guard minutes. So it can be really tough to know which players to pick. And the thing with the Memphis Grizzlies is that they're not a lottery team, so they're not tanking and trying to develop, young players, nor are they a strong playoff contender. So they're not getting like huge wins. They're not going on huge winning streaks. So sometimes when their games don't go well, their minutes also vary. Like for example, maybe if they're getting blown out one game, John Morant will only get 20 minutes a game. So I would say that Memphis Grizzlies is a team that you have to be really careful about when you're trying to stream their players.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Memphis Grizzlies is a team that's really hard to predict, even kind of I would say stay away from in terms of even like the superstar, like you said, like John Moran, like could play only 20 minutes in a blowout. So that's really unpredictable. And in terms of being a top 3 round pick, he's really like uh, risky, so to speak. Um, on this topic of teams as best fantasy players and how a winning team or a losing team is in relation to fantasy points, I wanted to kind of touch base and discuss about a stat that's one of the newest stats in basketball is basically called the plus minus. And I think plus minus is something that's really kind of not discussed too much and kind of underrated because you can have a really strong fantasy basketball player but actually not help the team win. Because usually you relate to okay, a superstar putting up a huge stats and essentially you expect the team to win. But I have a really good example from last night's game between the Orlando Magic and the LA Clippers. So if you look at Kawhi Leonard's stat line, really, really decent. So 28 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, perfect from the line in 37 minutes. Sorry, 35 minutes. His plus minus for that game was a -7. So how plus minus works is basically they count the amount of time you have on the floor versus the amount of points that is scored against your team versus the amount of points that you score for your that points is scored for your team. So basically, when you're on the floor, the amount of points that your team scores versus the amount of points that the opposition team scores. So that's why Kawhi was a -7. So through his 35 minutes last night, his team was outscored by 7 points. But he had a very decent fantasy stat line. On the other hand, Michael Carter Williams from the Orlando Magic only had 8.7 rebounds, 9 assists, but he was a plus 15 in 32 minutes of floor time. Meaning, for those 32 minutes, his team outscored the opposition team by 15 points. So, and as a result, the Magic overcame a 16-point deficit and wound up beating the Clippers. So I think this shows that even though Kawhi Leonard has a huge, or not even huge, like a very decent stat line, but at the end, he didn't help his team win. So yeah, that's my point of view.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why there's a lot of players that, they don't look very sexy on the stat sheet, but they do a lot of intangibles to help the team win. We talked about players such as, PJ Tucker, who is one of those players that do not put up a lot of stats, but his plus minus is usually really good because he plays good defense, and usually that translates to his team scoring after they get the stop as well.
Because I think having a high plus minus is something that the coaches do look into and put in consideration in terms of playing time, right? So if they see at the end of the game, even though Michael Carter Williams only put up an average stat line, but in the 32 minutes he played, his team was a plus 15, then the coach will see that, hey, with you playing all those minutes, we were a plus, we were gaining points at the opposition. So the odds of him getting more playing time in the future will dramatically increase.
Right, and that would be a really good predictor. Say using the Memphis Grizzlies guard lineup as when coach needs to look at which players deserves more play minutes, you can look at the plus minus. Like for example, D'Anthony Melton may not be averaging more points than the other guards, but if he's impacting winning a lot more, then he should translate to getting more minutes.
Exactly, and always as the major rule in fantasy always is, the more minutes you play, the more opportunity you have to get better stats. So in a way, plus minus plays a huge factor, even though it doesn't really show, but it plays a huge factor in terms of the potential of a player getting additional minutes to getting additional better stats.
Nice, Brian. Sharing some basketball wisdom here.
So we'll see if my prediction makes sense. If people with higher plus minuses will get more minutes, therefore resulting in better stats.
All right, Brian. Do you have any teams that are on your eye in terms of coming to winning, or like teams to just be on the lookout for?
I think you touched on it off the air with me, was the Minnesota Timberwolves, right? And Karl-Anthony Towns. He puts up huge numbers, but his team keeps losing. So I think that's another team, and also with other players on his team as well. I mean, we touched on Jalen Noel before, and Ricky Rubio and Anthony Edwards. So yeah, that's one team I would keep my eye on.
Yeah, they're another team. If you look at kind of they're actually the opposite of the Grizzlies, where they have a front court inconsistency in minutes, where the coaches actually started like a bunch of different lineups, whether it's Hernan Gomez, Vanderbilt in the beginning of the year, Jaden McDaniels now, I believe. So
and
these players are getting
Naz Reid,
yeah, especially when Karl-Anthony Towns was out. So it's really hard to predict these players' fantasy, other than Karl-Anthony Towns, and the next player would be Malik Beasley, who was suspended for like 12 games. There aren't many players that are very consistent or like reliable. So Timberwolves definitely.
So another team that actually comes to mind when we kind of like talked about is actually the New York Knicks.
Yes.
I think because Tom Thibodeau is a coach. I also like, depending on the coach, Tom Thibodeau is a coach that really likes to rely on his veterans, and that does not bode well for teams that have a lot of young talent, which the Knicks do. I mean, they have Obi Toppin from this year. They have Kevin Knox III from a couple of years ago. They have Emmanuel Quickly, IQ. He's a really good player, but Tom Thibodeau does not trust his young players enough. So he gives a lot of potential minutes to the veterans on his team, like the Alex Burke, like the Reggie Bullocks. Like those are the players that get 30 plus minutes per night, but not performing as well on the fantasy side. But they get the trust of the coach. They defend well. So that's another team that's hard to predict.
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully, after listening to this, you guys will be a bit more considerate and you have like some more point of views when you're picking players off the waiver wire, especially because maybe one night, let's say like Emmanuel Quickly has a big night. You see him rostered in like, plus 10% of the leagues. But then the next night or the next time he plays, he only plays like 10 minutes. And this is not because like he's not like it may not be because he's like injured or in foul trouble. It's just the nature of how, the coaches run the rotations and, which players get the playing time and the inconsistencies related to like their plus minus as well.
And certain coaches have way shorter leashes on young players than other coaches. So, in that point of view or aspect, the young players are very hesitant because they're like, okay, one mistake, one turnover, one missed assignment, then I'm on the bench.
Lots of things to consider,
Yeah,
not just what you see on your app.
exactly.
All right. So we got a bit of a shorter week, but hopefully we actually, hopefully a lot of value in the wisdom that we're spitting this week. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.
All right. Thanks for listening.